Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Cheryl, and I'm joined today by Gino and our old friend Michael Pedersen. And we have a very special guest today. We have James Savage, who is the head of sound at the Chicago Shakespeare Theater. And we're going to be talking about a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, microphone techniques for theatrical productions. But before we dive in, just a few items of housekeeping. First of all, this webinar is being recorded, as they always are. So if you miss anything or you want to direct a colleague to it, you can always go to shure.com/training to access this webinar. It will be available probably early sometime next week. We also have a lot of great other webinars there that have been archived from the past. So there's a lot of great knowledge across a wide range of topics. So please feel free to peruse that archive, shure.com/training. Lots of great learning there. Second of all, as we go through the webinar today, if you have any questions, please feel free to type those into the question pane. You'll see that in the right-hand side of your screen. If you do not see the question pane, look for a little toolbar with an orange box with a white arrow in it. Click on that. That will maximize that tool pane and should give you access to that question box. Ask as many questions you have. We will get to those at the very end of the webinar. So just hold on to the end and then we'll start answering questions. So that wraps up all the housekeeping. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to the team. Tell us all about microphone techniques for theatrical productions, gentlemen.
Okay. Thank you, Cheryl, for that wonderful introduction. So thanks, everyone, for joining us here this morning. This is going to be a great topic and something that we're very excited to talk about. I'd like to start by thanking James for taking time out of your schedule to be here.
No problem.
Yeah.
Good morning, everybody.
Appreciate having you here. And to Michael for actually suggesting the topic and helping get James in here. So
They get tired of listening to us, Gino. So we're
well, and that's a good point too. I mean, we could talk, endlessly about microphones, but it's always good, to get someone who's got the field experience,
who
does it every day, to come in here and talk about these things. And you actually teach too. Is that correct, James?
I do. I teach. It's only one quarter, but I teach sound technology at DePaul.
Oh, okay, great, cool, awesome. Well, so let's just get right into it here. I'm sure we have a lot to discuss. I'll just kind of start out by letting everyone know kind of how we're going to tackle things, what we're going to talk about here today. Again, because it's a big topic. I'm sure we could go on for hours and hours, but we got to try and fit it into about 45 minutes here. So, as we would with really any particular application on microphones that we would talk about, you have to talk about microphone selection. Which ones are the most appropriate choice of microphone for the particular thing you're trying to do, and then of course microphone placement. And in the theatrical application, that's a tricky thing, because more so than probably any other application you can think of, you generally don't want to see the microphone, so that creates some challenges. So we'll talk about what techniques are used there, as well as securing the microphone. When you have to hide it, you have to make sure it doesn't fall off or create additional noise issues and all of those other things. So we'll look at what some techniques you use there, as well as protecting the microphone. We were just discussing before the webinar started sort of what the microphone ends up in probably I would say adverse conditions. Let's say being close to created by the human body. So
yeah, that's a good way to say it.
Yeah, adverse. Trying to think of a decent way to say it this morning here. So and that's not ideal for a piece of technology there. So we'll see what we can do to help protect that investment there, and we'll wrap up with some wireless best practices, because as you'll see here in a moment, we're talking about wireless, of course, to be able to do the kind of productions that you see these days. It's pretty much a requirement that it has to be wireless microphones, which brings a host of other concerns and issues, which will kind of let you know how you can deal with some of that stuff. So, to help also kind of narrow the scope here, I wanted to talk about what specific mic techniques we're going to be discussing here. And it's pretty much going to be body microphones, that is, wireless microphones on the human body, because that is really the only way to get the sort of sound quality that I think the audience and maybe even people putting on the production are sort of expecting. I think we're all sort of conditioned these days to get that, to have that sort of Broadway musical type experience when you go to the theater, which is a very direct sound, very clear, very intelligible, right? And there's, I think, maybe a bit of a misperception that you can achieve similar results using microphones hung over the stage or maybe using boundary or surface mount type microphones along the edge of the stage. And that is a technique that can provide some useful sound reinforcement, maybe some voice lift, as you might call it, to help with intelligibility a little bit, but it is never going to be able to recreate the sound that you get with a microphone on the actor's body. And there's some reasons for that. One of the main things is that when you're using an overhead or a boundary microphone, it's far from the performer's mouth, right? And in every seminar, in every class we do on microphones, probably the one thing people remember the most is how often we say, keep the microphone as close to the sound source as possible, right? And that's because it helps minimize feedback issues, for one thing, right? Because the further the microphones are from the person's mouth, the more you have to turn them up. The more you have to turn them up, the more likely it is you're going to get a feedback loop. Because not only are the microphones far from the actor's mouth, they tend to then be closer to the loudspeakers, which, if you attended our webinar on gain before feedback, which Michael helped us with, you learned all about that. And that webinar is archived, and you can go watch it if you want to learn more about why that happens. And also, microphones, when they're further away, tend to be outside of what we call the critical distance, which is the point of the room where background noise and reverberation is equal to, or beyond that, greater than the direct sound. So it just is it's a more distant sound because you pick up more noise, you pick up more reverberation, all of these other things that you don't want being reinforced end up being reinforced. So in the long run, it's just, noise and feedback tend to be more the result of what you get with these techniques than you do that nice, clean, direct sound.
Do you ever use overhead mics, James?
In theater, it's now become a specific artistic choice that we want that actual sound quality, and so that mic becomes an option. But as a general rule, if you were to take, say, our theater stage at Chicago Shakespeare,
the thrust stage,
which is that deep thrust stage, that stage really automatically inherently limits the ability to do any level of area miking. If you hang mics from the ceiling, you're going to see them. They're going to be in the space. They become a large visual distraction. And if you put boundary mics or anything like that on the floor, the edge of our stage doesn't have an edge.
Right.
It's a place that an actor is automatically going to walk, so there's no good way to hide
Patrons
a mic.
could actually touch them too, couldn't
Exactly.
they?
It's right there. So so when we do it for the specific sort of audio quality that is achieved from it. And it's generally done in our particular space upstage of the proscenium line, the edge of the opening, since all of the speakers are downstage or more into the house from that
So
spot.
for spoken word things, for actually Shakespeare plays, or what exactly?
For Shakespeare plays, it's typically when we have musical elements that are involved, or we have an actor who has one specific quiet line that we'd like to enhance or pick up, and in which case we embed an area mic in a piece of scenery as close to that actor as possible. But it's not an overhead or general area mic.
Okay.
You will see area mics used in, I'm just going to bring this up, in a theatrical setting with wireless as emergency backups. When in a situation where the wireless mic dies, which we'll talk about in a bit, often you need something to smooth out the level of that actor for the time being until you can get a new mic on them. And so we'll put boundary mics down at the edge of the stage as a possible way of doing that. Now, once again, we go to Shakespeare, we can't do that. Same reasons that we just mentioned. There's just not a good way to put a boundary mic out. So the engineer has to use a technique where they basically are opening up anybody's mic that person is close to pick them up and keep some level, and then of course drop the volume of the band to maintain a reasonable volume output.
We use area mics for backstage cues so that people know where you're at. And so
Yes,
forth.
so we do have in both of our spaces, and it's very typical in theater, is we have an area mic in the ceiling that points down on the stage, and that just feeds our backstage monitor system. And it works quite well, and I can say we have a nice stereo Shure mic that's way overkill for the
Feed
use.
stereo. Wow, that's really impressive, man.
That was something that the contractors decided to do.
Wow.
But it works incredibly well for just general hearing what's going on in the room and picking up the voice so that people know what's going on backstage.
I know some people ask me at the Lyric Opera here in Chicago, they've got microphones that hang overhead, but those are used for WFMT for the live radio broadcasts, not for sound reinforcement.
So you see, and that's the point is you may see overhead microphones, but that's not necessarily what you're hearing.
Right, they're not being used for what you think they're being used for.
Right.
And there are some specific, very expensive systems that can use overhead mics to get to sort of enhance the image coming out into the house of what's being put out on stage. And those acoustic room enhancement systems are costly, B, difficult to implement properly, and so they're not used in most theatrical applications just because they're too expensive.
Right, like the Constellation system.
Those sorts of systems,
changes the reverberation of the. I was in a room once in San Francisco where it seated 100, but you could make it sound like a cathedral. It was really strange.
Yeah,
because your eyes and.
They're neat systems, and some of them work very well, and some of them do not work very well. But they still don't give you that sort of clean, what I would call at this point, Broadway sound that you would expect for a musical.
And ultimately, intelligibility is the most important thing. There's nothing more frustrating than sitting there watching a play or a musical and missing the plot because you can't understand what they're saying, right? So all the fancy, simulated reverberation and all of that is a complete waste if you're like, but what did he say? So
how about overheads for picking up a large choir or a large group of people or something?
That we don't have much call for that in most theatrical applications, but it does come up from time to time when you have a large chorus for, say, just a presentational type production. We did a production of In the Heights on the South Side, and it was just done basically as a reading, so nobody was really in costume, and the main group of actors were seated in a set of risers off to the left side of the stage, and in that particular situation, those actors sang all of the chorus lines when they weren't up at microphones on. Well, actually, they had head booms on, but but when they weren't up doing their particular moment at their music stand and just basically giving a reading, and so we had a few overhead mics for that sort of chorus section to pick up that voice.
But don't depend on them. Don't expect they're going to sound like headborne mics.
No, and you don't it works when you have a large group of a choir and they're all singing together because you have a much larger sound source to pick up.
Cool.
Yep.
Okay, so
and you heard it from the expert, folks.
There you go. It's not just Shure talking this time. So when we talk about microphone selection, there's really two things that we want to focus on here, as particular to this application, which is the polar pattern of the microphone and also the form factor of the microphone. Because again, we've got some very specific requirements here, which is, as I mentioned earlier, you don't want to see the microphone, and you have to be able to place it creatively, depending on costuming and wigs and all of that other kind of a thing here. So, when we talk about the polar pattern here, again, the two types that you see pictured here, which are the most common, are either omnidirectional, meaning the microphone picks up sound from all directions, or unidirectional, probably the cardioid type being the most popular, which you see here, which is meaning it picks up sound from one direction, hence the unidirectional, right? So there's some decisions to be made there, probably more often than not going to be omni, but I'll let James speak to that in a second, as well as the form factor, which again, we're not talking about handheld microphones here. We're talking about small microphones, almost I'd say 100% of the time condenser microphones, because you just can't make a dynamic microphone small enough for a theatrical application and have it still sound good and be hidden and all that stuff. So, condenser microphones pretty much across the board, usually either a lavalier type microphone or some sort of a head-worn microphone or a lav mic adapted to be a head-worn microphone or something like that. But I'll let James elaborate here. So
sure. The two sort of microphones that you have pictured here, we'll start there. The one on the left of your screen is obviously a lapel setup lav microphone, and actually, technically, they would be considered a mini. That size would be considered a mini lav,
That's an excellent point. Some of them are larger.
yeah, because an actual lav is generally about half an inch to a quarter of an inch in diameter, so it's a much larger.
That's just how
microphone.
you define it in theater, kind of.
Yeah,
Lav and mini lav.
Mini lav, and then you get into micro lav if you want to go there with the tiny.
I think Sanken makes some really tiny ones.
Yeah, and some B6 is a really tiny micro
the
lav would be an
Countryman, yeah.
example.
Right.
And so we would use the standard lavalier that you can see there on the lapel clip. That's the size microphone that we most often these days are putting into the hair or putting on in head-worn situations.
Always omnis, right?
In this case, yes, they would always be omni, and that goes back to polar pattern. Anytime you place a microphone next to a boundary surface, you interfere with that polar pattern. And with a cardioid microphone, the polar pattern already is being interfered with by the nature of it being cardioid. And the more directional a microphone is, let's say the less good it sounds. It still can sound very good, but you start to pick up artifacts from the phase cancellation that is necessary to make that microphone directional. So when you stick that next to a boundary surface, you're adding another layer into that, and you start to get more artifacts that are undesirable.
In the boundary, in this case, is the body or the head, right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So an analogy there might be with a handheld microphone, the rappers that cup the mic when they're singing, right? Similar sort of, it actually messes with the pattern of the microphone.
Yep. And so we want as natural and open sounding of a mic as possible. And so the Omni mic has the least amount of phasing going on in it. It's got the most open structure. And so when you stick it next to that boundary surface, it has the least ill reaction to being stuck next to the boundary surface.
Also less cable noise, because directional microphones have cable noise.
That is true.
And that's also a problem when you're on an actor.
That is very true.
Yep.
So because we were already sticking the mic next to a boundary surface, we use Omni lavs in I would say 99% of the situations that you're going to come across. The only time that might differ is typically if you're using a head boom microphone, where that element is being moved out in front of the mouth. Most of the time, we'll still use Omni in those situations because the proximity of the microphone element itself to the mouth is what helps keep gain before feedback high. It helps just proximity alone. You've got a much higher volume of sound coming from the mouth of the actor getting to the microphone. You're going to get much higher gain out of that mic. On the other hand, there are certain situations in shows where you need to send a lot of the vocal back onto stage for the actors to be able to hear each other. An example of a show that we do at Shakespeare is the Q Brothers shows that are rap-oriented shows. And those shows, the show is very, very loud. And if they don't get vocal back on stage, they can't hear each other to be able to actually perform the show.
Okay.
So in those sorts of situations, we use a directional microphone. We actually put cardioid booms on them in order to get a bit more gain out of the microphone to help combat the loud monitors.
Do you the first theater thing I remember seeing with head-worn microphones or boom microphones was Rent.
Yeah.
That would seem to be set the stage for like accepting seeing it.
Yeah.
And the fact that they had high sound pressure level on stage.
Yeah, that's the sound pressure level tends to be sort of the biggest factor as to whether you need to move towards a boom or not. It just gets it that much closer to the mouth, regardless of whether it's an Omni or a cardioid. That's gonna give you gain you a lot of feedback control overall.
Have you run a situation with a director in the past that wanted the high sound pressure level but didn't want to see the boom, and you?
Yes, that absolutely happens, and there's just a moment of reality of here is the limitations of what we can do and how loud we can get.
Do they accept your explanation, or do you have to normally prove it?
Ultimately, I would say about 70% of the time they'll accept it when we say these are your options, and you've got to pick one. You can either see the microphone and we can get it really loud, or we can hide it and we have to have a controlled volume. And there's a 30% of the time that we have to go prove it a little bit more through one means or another. But for the most part, we can generally powwow them into saying, look, this is just the reality of the physics that's at work.
And the longer
here.
you've been doing it, more likely they are to trust you too.
Yeah.
I've worked with you in the past, and he knows what he's talking about. Okay.
It's a good, I think, a point worth reinforcing in here again is which you said, but it's something that we harp on all the time too. Is more important than the polar pattern when we're talking about these high, sound level situations is getting the microphone closer to the mouth.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's such a huge thing. So speaking of that, let's move into kind of some placement examples here. Again, I guess with a boom mic like you see on the left, that's kind of an obvious one. It goes at the corner of the mouth. But when you're utilizing the mini lavs, I think you have a lot more options in terms of where you might place the mic, right?
Yeah. So we'll make a quick comment about chest-worn lavs. And the reason that you're not going to see them very often in theatrical application for a show, it comes up time to time when we need to have a microphone on a person that it just goes on them. We're going to use it for effect, and it comes right off of them in the next scene, in which case sometimes putting that mic on the chest is an acceptable answer as a way to...
An effect like what, James?
like reverb or echo.
Okay.
Like you've got scary ghost and you just need it for one moment in the show.
Okay.
And so you're going to just affect the voice.
Got it.
And you're not worried about super clean intelligibility, specifically not worried about the actual sound quality of that mic being as close to natural as
And
possible.
on the chest, just because you can get it on and off quicker?
Exactly.
Yeah.
On the other hand, the rest of the time, we do what we can to get it on the head. And as you can see from this picture here, this is actually one of my lead engineers at Shakes, who does a lot of our shows, kindly made this rig up for us and stuck it on his head and took a picture. Is a type of rig we call a halo, but the important aspect is where the microphone element itself is sitting on his head. Anytime we have the opportunity to get it directly on the middle of the forehead, that's where we try and get it most of the time. It's a harder position to get on people who often men's hairstyles don't allow for it, because there's, as you can see here, this is very visible, purposefully though. And so this would be something we wouldn't necessarily send on stage because you can see it incredibly well. But this gives an example of sort of the placement that we're looking for within that sort of center line of the forehead from sort of mid forehead up towards the hairline area. It just gives the most sort of natural sound from the voice. It avoids most of the sort of nasal noise that you would get from mics that are more further down on the face that might pick up more of that noise.
So just breathing noises.
Yeah.
So I do fairly commonly see like just it sort of hooked over the ear, so not like a boom mic that comes down to the mouth, but just over the ear.
Right, and we have a picture of an ear rig that we'll get to in a second and talk about how that works. But
this is preferred.
This is preferred, and it's preferred because it just gives you the most sort of centralized sound. You're not picking up any of the resonance cavities in the face as much. There's no sinus cavity. There's no sinus cavity on your forehead, and that's actually really important. We're looking for the best quality that microphone can allow us by not putting it in as adverse condition as we possibly can. So there's a lot of natural already. We're in a situation where we're going to be putting that mic in the worst place possible, but we try and choose the best or the least worst of those positions that we can, and center of the forehead has the least drawbacks in that particular regard.
Let me add something just for the neophytes that maybe, and that this is real obvious to James and Gino, but when you have the microphone on the head, you can't change the distance between the mic and the mouth.
Yeah.
Right.
You can when it's on the chest.
Right.
And when you change that distance, the audio quality changes. So that's another reason to have it on the head, is keep that distance between the mic and the mouth constant.
It's very constant. And the other artifact that you get with chest mic is, of course, the person moves their head around, and now their relationship to the microphone changes greatly. When it's on the head, it's always positioned in the same place.
Yep.
So that EQ time that you've taken to make that mic sound the way that you want it to sound is going to be much more consistent throughout the actor's movement across the board. And gain-wise, when it's on the chest, you're going to be chasing their level as they move their head around. You might end up having to compress it heavily to keep it under control, whereas on the head, generally we still start to use compression, but we use much less compression. Okay. It's just to generally take the top end off when people get really peaky.
Cool.
So this is sort of what we would be the ideal position for most of our head-worn mics when possible.
So if you had a hat on, you could cover it that way.
Yeah.
Certain wigs.
Hats add another level of
another
complexity.
Reflections. Yeah.
Extra boundary surface.
Yeah.
And so actually that's a good point. When we do have somebody who's going to be in and out of a hat, we will often put them in an ear rig, which we'll talk about in a minute. Okay. Because of proximity to the brim of that hat, the ear rig brings it further down and gets it further away from the hat.
Okay. So,
but if you'll notice, you'll see that the rig does specifically have the lavalier pointed straight down at the mouth. Even though that lavalier is omnidirectional, it still is more sensitive towards the front end of the capsule.
Right, particularly for the higher frequencies.
For high frequencies, Right.
Which is the intelligibility.
Mm-hmm.
So even though it's omni, don't get lazy and assume you can just let it point any old way. Like, still try to, it still has what looks like a front. So
yeah.
Cool. Well, let's take a look then at some different ways that you would actually secure the microphone to the body. Then, once to try and get it in that position we just talked about,
Absolutely.
Or whatever the best position is.
So as you saw with the first picture there, that was a halo, and that's a piece of elastic that the actor puts around their head. It's a very quick method of getting
about that one first if you want.
Yeah, it's a very quick method of getting the mic on and off the actor, and if they have enough hair to cover the microphone cable and cover the piece of elastic, it's a very convenient and easy thing for the actor to get on and off.
Where do you get the elastic, or is there any specific type you like, or just?
It's just cord elastic that you can get at I'm going to say costume shop, but that's not useful for most people. That you can get it at any sort of sewing supply store,
fabric store,
place like that.
Great. Okay, thanks.
Cool. So in this case, it's actually the mic cable is sort of the back part of the halo here.
Yeah,
and then
and you can do it as a full loop and then just loop kind of the cable through. But this is become more standard for us because you can adjust the size of the halo by moving the back knot in order to make the halo bigger or smaller, so it's more secure on the head.
Interesting.
Then the other picture, going back one more, these would be what we do actually more typically. The clips that you see on the two microphones are called toupee clips, and you can get them from wig and hair stores. You can also get them online if you look it up. And a toupee clip is traditionally used to hold on a toupee. It's sewn into a men's toupee and used to clip to what remaining hair that person has. Okay. But it's also used in wigs as well to clip down the edge of the wig. So it's very common use in wig shops as far as theater is concerned. But we, as an industry, sound adopted them. In the entire time I've been doing sound, which is almost 20 years, I have not had them be present in putting mics on heads. So we've been using them for quite a long time. And it's a very inexpensive clip. They're very, very inexpensive. And what you can see is that this is the technique that we use the most often, is the clip itself is actually attached to the cable using a piece of elastic, once again, back to that same sort of thin, round, standard elastic. There's two holes in either side of the clip. We take that piece of elastic across the back of the clip, and then and we tie it in, and we'll actually usually put a little bit of like clear fingernail polish to lock the knot to make sure it doesn't want to untie itself once it's on the head, because sweat makes knots untie themselves. And then we make sure that there's just a little bit of slack in it when we tie it off, and then that means that we can loop the cable through it to help secure it. And you can then slide that toupee clip forward and backward, and use it to clip it into the actor's hair. So the mic would come up, say, the center of the head, and be clipped in down the center of the head. Then you brush the hair over it, and then where it comes down the back of the neck, we would use tape. Generally speaking, most of us use the myriad of 3M products that are on the market as far as medical tapes are concerned. Transpore is one of sort of the most common types of tape you will see across the theater industry, because it tears very easily, and so the actors can put it on themselves with very little. You don't need scissors, you don't need anything crazy. You can just tear the tape off the roll and stick it on the back of your head and keep your cable.
You get a medical supply or online or whatever.
Yeah.
3M.
Yeah.
Okay.
And these days, I most often will buy it on Amazon, because you can get it in bulk and get it relatively inexpensive from Amazon.
Okay, great.
So
hints.
you're saying we shouldn't use gaff tape then to secure
Gaff tape is not the best idea.
I only mentioned that because
Believe it or
I know
not, gaff
people try
tape,
that.
gaff
so.
tape will sweat right off.
I bet it would. Yeah, I bet it would.
Some other techniques, since we're on tape, it goes to the next sort of methodology of securing the microphone. For somebody who is completely bald, and you want to put the microphone in a weird place, and they're going to have a hat on or something like that, sometimes we will tape the mic directly to the head, and bring it down around the hat. Usually we'll use an ear rig, which we'll get to in a minute, but we, in certain situations, you'll end up just actually taping the microphone up. And there are some other products to help with sweaty actors, because I know this question's probably going to come up.
Oh, yeah.
There are different types of tape that have different formulas, and so they work better with different people's sweat. So sometimes you have to experiment with the different types of medical tape on the market. And the other one that you can use is a barrier film. That if you look it up under medical supplies, it's generally a wipe that you put down, and that wipe actually creates a barrier over the skin and keeps the sweat from getting to the base of the tape, and helps hold the tape on the head for longer.
Do you keep a mental record of the actors and what they need, or do you keep like a written record of the actors? Because I know you use a lot of the same actors.
When we use the same actors, we generally keep a mental record of what they need as far as like taping and that sort of stuff is concerned. I've never thought about keeping an actual written record.
It was just because it was interesting. I think for the audience to say, how do we keep track of this? Probably just need to write it down, and
Yeah, I mean, once you're in a show, you have a set like we'll put an actor in their mic, whatever that position ultimately is. Will be discover that throughout the tech process. Move it around until we get the best sound and sort of the best balance of visible versus not visible, as well as like, are they wearing a hat and taking it off? Right. So where do we need to get the mic so that it's the least affected by the hat as possible? And then we end up taking pictures to document exactly where that microphone sits on that person's head.
That's a great.
So that we can put them up at the dressing stations for those actors. So when they put their own mic on, or when somebody comes by to put the mic on for them,
that's a great
they
hint.
can refer to the picture.
That's a great hint.
And it's a good point too about the different techniques for the actors too, is that there's not necessarily a one size fits all. You can't just assume that this is my technique and this is going to work for everybody, or I use this tape and it always works. Like, you do have to sometimes experiment and find out what's going to work for each person.
Different body chemistries, as he says.
Yes.
I did notice here before we move on to the ear set that on the left here, there's actually two microphones in this shot here. So what calls for that situation?
That's an excellent point. That is a double mic rig. And so if you have an actor who doesn't ever get really off stage very often, and they're a critical lead actor, and so their main story driving, we will put two packs and two elements on that actor.
Oh.
And so if one of the elements, the primary element, goes down, the mix engineer can switch to the backup.
So two packs both live.
Both live, both
But only
transmitting.
you're hearing
all the time.
one.
Yep.
Yeah. And put them close close to each other, or do you separate them out?
We try and separate them out on the belt a little bit, just because depending on frequency content, you can get intermod issues with the packs so close to each other.
Okay. Cool. That's a good point. I didn't see that.
One more thing on the taping too. So do you typically tape the cable all the way down, like against their body, like to help minimize clothing noise and things like that, or?
Well, as Michael pointed out, OmniLobs have a tendency to pick up a little bit less of the clothing noise and that sort of cable rubbing. We do secure it so it doesn't move around or get yanked on off their head, because that'll move its position. So the mic comes, if it's an ear rig or over the head, over the center of the head, or however we ultimately end up affixing it to them, we'll bring it down the back of the neck. What I personally like to do is ask the actor to look all the way to one side, either left or right, so that we have the most stretch across the back of the neck. And then we tape the cable across the neck that way, not up the neck, because you want it needs to flex, and it won't if you have a big piece of tape there. It's going to end up falling off. So you put a piece of tape at the bottom of the hairline and a piece of tape down at the base of the neck. And when they move around, you'll have a little bit of a cable bulge. But ultimately, you can end up figuring out how to manage that so it doesn't stick out and look weird, but it allows the actor to move around and keeps the mic secure, and then helps isolate the rustling and cable noise handling noise you might end up getting otherwise.
Cool. But another reason to use Omnis.
Yeah.
So, cool. And then this one.
Okay, so this is an ear rig. This one is a built ear rig. You can buy earpieces that are made for holding earbuds in. If you think of your typical sort of reporter, the earpiece that they put in their ear to hear the station talk to them, that earpiece is fit into an ear rig that actually snaps over the back of holds it over the back of their ear and keeps it in place. You can get those parts. Telex makes several different types for their ear rigs, and some of the other companies that make those particular type of earbuds that are relatively low quality sounding earbuds, but they don't need to be.
Right, the communication grade. Yeah.
The downside to those is they have a loop for that earbud to fit through, and you would see it sticking out in the ear canal area. It just gets distracting, so we end up always modifying them, cutting that loop off, and then we have to make sure it's not sharp and pointy and poking into the actor. And so it can take a lot more time to make that type of rig work well with an actor versus just making a rig. And so this one is probably made out of millinery wire, which is a type of wire that's used for making the brim of a hat stiff, for example. It's another one of those you can get it at a fabric store, generally speaking.
Millinery wire. Okay.
And most of the time, millinery wire is a stainless steel wire wrapped in cotton.
Oh.
So the fact that it's stainless is great. It means you don't have to worry about it rusting on their head, because that does happen if you put metal on somebody's head for a show every 8 nights a week for 4 weeks. So the millinery wire gives us that sort of rust prevention that we're looking for. And then to make the shape and to make what you see here is actually 2 pieces of millinery wire. One that comes all the way around the ear and then comes out down the mic element cable. And that allows us to position the mic on the head and sort of actually have a rigid fixed piece of wire there that we can use to get the mic position the same every time.
Okay.
So you can do it without that extra piece of wire, but you generally end up with needing to tape the element where it comes off the top of the ear. You still need to put a little bit of tape on this as well, but it's a much more positionable option. The second piece of wire, it literally just wraps around the ear, and then you shape it around the back of the actor's ear so that it's sort of hooks around the bottom of the earlobe across the top.
You ever use heat shrink tubing at all?
I have used heat shrink tubing in the past. The reason that we tend to, and that's another good point, is that the blue tool you see on the table there is a tool called a Hellerman tool. And Hellerman sleeves, which are what these tan sleeves are are a cable management product
Oh, really?
that are a very stretchy latex tube
Okay.
used for doing cable bundles and industrial wiring and stuff like that. But by the nature of being latex, it's as long as you don't have a latex allergy, it works very, very well. And the tool, you actually wet the tool, or you can get actual special lubricant if you want. You slide the sleeve over it, and then the tool actually stretches the sleeve open, so you can slip it around.
Wow. That's great, man. I don't know about that. That's very interesting.
The nice advantage to this is that if that microphone does survive the show, which is something we should talk about, is the fact that these microphones are being sweat on. There's going to be some reliability issues that come up from that aspect. Sweat's much, much more harsh than just water. But if that microphone needs to be swapped out or changed over, you can cut a Hellerman sleeve off very easily. It comes off with no problems, and you can put a new one on, and it doesn't require any heat. It doesn't require anything that might damage the microphone
That's great.
itself.
I looked that up. I've never heard that term before.
Yeah.
Cool. Talked about that. But speaking of sweat,
Sweat.
I guess that's the lead into the next topic, right? Is the microphone being, as we said, in adverse conditions, thanks to the human body.
Yes.
Sweat is an absolute killer of microphones. Even the best top-end microphones that a lot of us use are water resistant, not proof. And if they get wet, and just with water, you can generally set them off to the side, and they'll dry out, and they'll continue, and they will operate once they're dry.
Just
again.
air dry?
Yeah.
Do special
You can put them in a desiccant bag, which is what we'll do.
The
if we need it.
little bags of stuff that do not eat.
Yeah. Yeah,
Do not eat
exactly.
bags, yeah.
You can buy desiccant packs online. You can buy them from Amazon. They now make them in a metal tin that you can put in your oven to dry them back out.
Oh, great. Yeah, okay.
So if and when we had shows that we have a lot of sweaty people, we have a couple of those that we are rechargeable, so to speak, so that they can absorb more water.
Right.
The thing with sweat, as we said before, is that it's unique to each individual's chemical makeup.
Mm-hmm.
So sweat contains obviously lots of salt, but it also contains oil and a little bit of acidity and all sorts of things that electronics really are not fond of. In the best case scenario, somebody's sweat will be mostly just salty, in which case what happens is that sweat gets into the microphone and over time deposits salt on the diaphragm. And that as that microphone dries out, the water dries out, but the salt does not go anywhere else. It stays on the diaphragm. So that microphone over time becomes dark. You start to lose high-end response out of the microphone.
That's how you first notice it?
Yeah.
Okay.
And at that point, the microphone is going to have a limited lifespan of usefulness before it's so dark that you can't EQ it anymore.
Let me give you an idea. What's the worst case you've heard of someone sweating on a microphone? Every night, once a week, every night. He
Every
shakes
night.
his head. Wow, wow.
And that just depends on that individual chemistry.
It depends on the individual chemistry. Some people have, and it's not against them. It's our problem to figure out
Right.
how to help protect that microphone. But some people have more, let's call it caustic sweat,
Sure.
as far as that's concerned.
You see it in fabrics, how they can go
Yeah.
through fabrics and so forth.
And so that microphone will, have no problems on one person who's super sweaty. It'll get dark. You'll get water in it. It'll start to sound like it's underwater, but you can put it off to the side. It'll dry out, and it'll be good for the next show.
Mm-hmm.
And other people, it'll get dark. It'll sound like it's underwater, and then it will actually. I haven't actually had a microphone do. Because most of the elements now have some level of water resistance on them. But back in the day, before they did, there used to be a phenomenon that we would call the mic's gone supernova, where the mic would actually start to increase in electrical conductivity because of the sweat and the electrolyte in the microphone head. It would get super loud, not particularly good sounding,
Right,
but it would get really, really loud, and then it would just die.
wow, that's interesting.
Supernova is a good term for that.
Yeah, it is.
So that would be a real indicator that you had a problem, was when the mic started to get really loud. You knew the next thing that was going to happen was it was going to go away.
Okay.
So all of these things lead to us trying to figure out ways of keeping the sweat away from the element as much as possible. The point of having a little bit of millinery wire on that boom is so that you can actually tilt the head of the microphone just away off of the head and keep it away from the person's skin. Yeah. That will help keep some of the sweat out of it. In the most extreme situations, there's a technique I particularly like. Some designers are less fond of it because it can change the way that the microphone sounds just a little bit. I refer to it as socking. I learned this back in college, actually, from my professor. And that technique, you take pantyhose and you cut them into a big, just flat piece, stretch them so that the weave is a little bit open, spray it lightly with Scotchgard. Scotchgard is water repellent, so it will actually help repel the sweat away from the microphone for a while. Now, over time, Scotchgard breaks down so that those pantyhose are going to get wet. But when that happens, you cut the sock off, and generally speaking, the sweat will be contained to the actual sock itself and not get into the element.
So you make a little square or something and then wrap it around behind the microphone. And how do you tie it off behind the microphone?
Take a needle and thread and stitch it on right around the back of the head.
Wow.
But because you can get pantyhose in all colors, you can get it to either match the actor's head, you can get it to match their skin.
I hadn't thought about that. Yeah.
So it's a much easier way to hide the element and keep that sock hidden as well. And then on that subject, actually, real quick, hidden, you would have noticed we do actually paint the elements sometimes so that they match the actor's hair better. Than,
what do you use for type of paint?
Usually we'll use an acrylic paint.
Yeah, it dries quick.
It dries pretty quick, and you will have to repaint. Yeah, it will flake off over time, but you can get it to match their skin or their hair better, and then it hides it better.
And I can just tell you, just for other reasons, you go to Michael's Hobbies, which I think are all, and they have all kinds of different colors of acrylic paint. Yeah, every color you possibly could want. Yeah.
Cool.
The reality is those are kind of the two main techniques. The third technique that we use for sweat prevention is called a donut, and that is literally like a little tiny O-ring that we just slip over the microphone head, and it helps to keep sweat that might roll down the microphone cable from wanting to get to the head as easily.
Physically trying to block the sweat. Yeah.
Hardware store, right?
Mm-hmm. Usually like McMaster Car or someplace like that, you can find little tiny rubber O-rings that you can...
That's a really good idea.
And you'll see that actually on some head booms. You'll see a little tiny sweat prevention plastic shield donut piece that they put right behind the element.
We've got it on a couple of ours, but the O-ring's a great idea for something that doesn't have it.
Exactly. Those are really the main techniques and we just play with the exact mic placement, and then the final thing is just keeping that person as dry as possible. So when they come off stage, you have somebody there with a towel, and they blot their head and try and get as much of the sweat off of their head as possible.
It's unrealistic to not expect sweat outs of microphones. Right?
Completely unrealistic. We generally will talk attrition numbers of losing 40 to 50% worth of the original microphones by the end of a 2 to 2.5 month run.
40 to 50%. Wow. Okay.
There you go.
There you go.
Now, we don't always, but that's something that
you plan upon.
You have
that we have to plan upon.
Plan for it. Sure.
That's good.
Yeah.
And as far as makeup goes, I mean, I guess there's not really a lot you can do with that other than just the same sort of technique. I mean, keep it away from the face as much as possible, right?
If they're spraying hairspray, tell them to put a hand in front of the lav to keep hairspray from getting into the lav, that sort of stuff. We generally just make sure that the actor understands that element, if you get makeup or sweat on it or hairspray on it, you're going to damage it, and you need to. It's as much for them as it is for us. Mm-hmm. That if they want to be heard, they need to take some responsibility for what we're giving them. Mm-hmm. And that taking it from that standpoint kind of helps people understand. Oh yeah, this is important for what I'm doing on stage, so I should at least be conscientious of it to a degree.
It's a psychological trick.
Yeah. Like the other makeup thing is that a couple of the companies make makeup caps, which is generally a red plastic flagged cap that you snap over the top of the microphone element itself while they're in the dressing room doing makeup and doing hairspray. It helps seal the front end of the mic up and keep those things out of it. And being bright red, generally it's easy enough to see, so the actor
To take it
or
off.
whoever remembers to take it off before they go out on stage.
A good point. Cool. Okay. I want to do just a couple of things on wireless and make sure we leave some time for questions here.
So this has been fascinating. I can't believe we're
Closing in on on an hour here. So we have plenty of other webinars posted on various wireless topics that, of course, are important, but that are important no matter what your application is, which is frequency coordination and antenna selection and placement and mounting and all of that sort of stuff. So in the interest of time here, I just want to make kind of one point on this before I ask James for some of the best practices that he uses in theaters, which is when you're choosing a wireless system for a theatrical application, most of the time you're going to be operating a lot of wireless microphones, right? It's very rare that you need just a couple, depending on, I guess, what show you're doing or whatever. But a lot of times what we run into is someone who, again, wants to recreate this Broadway sound type of situation, and they want to put
and in middle school,
and it's in middle school, and they know they want to put a wireless on everyone, but they don't realize that means you have to buy a really good wireless system. That is the major differentiator between good meaning expensive. The major differentiator between an affordable, low-cost wireless microphone system and the more expensive ones is how many wireless mics you can use on the same stage at the same time. That's why the third sort of question here about choosing a wireless system is how many are you using, the total number. Because if you need 20 wireless mics, you can't run down to the local music store and buy the $300 wireless mic, 20 of those, and expect it to work. It's just not going to happen.
And do what the major theaters do. James could talk about that. Is that when you need more, you rent. Right. When they did Follies, 40-some channels for Follies? I can't remember.
There were 36, yeah.
Right.
And you rented those.
Yeah,
you didn't buy them because you needed them for the 6-week run or whatever it was, and then...
Yeah, I mean, we've subsequently now owned those, but that's because we use them all the time.
Okay. But you're not doing a 2-week run and then putting them away for 50 weeks.
No.
Yeah. You need them because they're tools that you're using every
day.
Every day, right.
Because it makes financial sense because we're using them every day.
But if you didn't, you would rent.
And there's certainly certain theaters in Chicago that do rent every time, and a lot of that
I think the Lyric rents all the time. Yeah.
And a lot of that comes out of, and there are other theaters who are looking at going that direction, and it comes out of if you're working with an outside designer, they may have their specific preference on what type of microphone they would like to use, what wireless they would like to use, and if you have a purchased system, that's what you have.
Right.
Because you're not gonna rent another system if you've already owned all the stuff you need to do it.
Right.
So in those sorts of higher end situations, the leasing or renting option can make more sense to give the.
Plus, if you do that, then if you have a failure, it's up to the rental company to get you one, and you don't have to worry about that yourself, or have additional ones sitting backstage. Right.
That is very true.
Which probably has some relief for you as the main sound guy.
It can be, that's for sure. We do send back a lot of microphones for repair because they need service and maintenance. That's for sure.
Yep.
So maybe just real quickly, some of the things that you do, particularly in terms of like protecting and mounting the body pack, which again is a more unique requirement than if you're just a guitar player using a body pack, right?
So in theatrical situations, be it a pageant, be it a theater show, you're going to obviously want to hide that mic pack. So unlike a concert situation where that mic pack can live on the belt outside of the body, outside of the clothing, we're actually putting that pack in between the clothing and the skin. It's, once again, a very sweaty environment, and that becomes a big problem. You have very sensitive electronics next to a lot of sweat, and the two things don't always go together very well, or very rarely ever go together. There are a few options out on the market that claim to be hermetically sealed and theoretically would be okay with that. But there's always a point of entry where the sweat can become a problem.
Where the mic connects to the body pack.
Exactly. That's one of the biggest ones right there. And so there's the technique that we've used for the longest is in the old school Broadway world of doing it would be to use unlubricated condoms. You put the condom over the mic pack. It's an expensive solution. They break. They're hard to put on. It's time consuming. As of more recently, most of us have gone to U-line, let's call them display zipper bag, little Ziploc bag type bags. You can get them in from U-line. You can get them in mass bulk, and you can get them for the right at the exact size of the pack, so that you don't have a lot of extra plastics flopping around while you're trying to put it on the body. And you just cut 2 little holes in the top so the antenna and the mic element stick out. You zipper the mic in there. And then generally speaking, if we're doing that technique these days, I invert the mic pack and put it upside down. So the plastic bag keeps the sweat out of any of the seams of the mic element of the mic pack itself. But in order to keep the sweat out of the connector, when it's upside down, the sweat will roll over the connector as opposed to roll into the connector.
So these are not specifically for wireless. These are just
Ziploc
bags that happen to be the right size to fit these.
Yeah. And you can get the exact right ones from Uline. And
Uline, okay.
You
Online? Uline is
Uline is a company that does display bags. They do slip sheet for packaging. They do all sorts of packaging.
uline.com?
Yep.
Great, thanks.
And so that's sort of become one of the more common techniques. Like I said, I put the pack upside down to keep sweat out of the connector, because I've had an actor who was perfectly fine right before the curtain came up. The curtain came up and they had sweat out the connector, and all it was crackle. Sweat in the connector, straight crackle. Yep. So we do that. The other option is now there's a company as of recent, wirelessmicbelts.com, that you see here on the screen. They have been making the neoprene mic packs. Those packs have, you can see at the top, there's actually very large Velcro sort of grommeting at the top to help keep sweat from rolling down the cable and down the antenna. So they're very useful, and actually for what you get for one of those bags, and those mic packs last a lifetime. They're very well made. Their prices are extremely reasonable. And so if you know that you're investing in 20 body mics and that you're going to be using them on 20 actors over and over again in the same pack, it's kind of worth that. I think they're like $20, $25 area to get 20 of those to go with your mic packs.
Yeah. Great. I know we wanted to talk about some battery issues, but do we have any questions there, Cheryl, that we might want to get to? Okay, so we'll truncate that a little bit. Maybe someone will ask about batteries, and then we can discuss that in more detail. I do want to make sure people know that we have a booklet available for download on our website, the Audio Systems Guide for Theater Performances. You might want to go take a look at that at some point. But let's spend a few minutes here on some questions from the audience.
All right. First question here. Can you effectively run a WL93 as a four-head mic versus the B3 type mics that we saw in the illustrations?
So the WL93, for those who don't know, is one of the more inexpensive omnidirectional lavs that Shure has, and yes, you can do this. I mean, it's still omni, so it's more of a rectangular flat thing instead of the round ones, but concept is the same. Yeah, there's a little hole, a little opening on one side of it. Don't push that part against the forehead. You'd want to make sure that's facing away from the forehead, but otherwise I think that would work.
Okay. Somebody that needed a little bit more clarification on the socking pantyhose technique. Do you wrap the element, the actor's head, or cover the element to camouflage it on the actor?
I suppose you could wrap the actor's head, but that would be kind of ineffective for the show.
If you're doing a robbery scene, it would work really well.
Perfectly. No, so you cut about a 2-inch by 2-inch square piece of the pantyhose, and then you put the mic head right in the middle of that square, and then you very carefully, without stretching it too much, fold it over the element itself, and then you take generally thread and needle and thread and actually sew right at the back of the mic head, not through the cable, around the cable to adhere that sock to the mic head. And then to finish it off, obviously you take scissors and cut off all of the excess pantyhose.
Michael has adapted that technique into an FAQ that you can find on the Shure website. What do you search?
Savage.
Search Savage.
I gave him credit.
That's an easy search term to remember.
All right. Let's see. How do you handle wind noise on actors that move rapidly or fast around the stage?
Well, I'll add on to that question since we didn't want to talk. Do you use windscreens at all?
We use, actually, this picture is a great example. These are head boom mics. This is a very active show, and they are directional microphones in this particular aspect. But those particular mics have to be windscreened because of they're in front of the mouth, so there's more plosive and air noise coming out of the mouth. So in those particular situations, we do use windscreens. On the other hand, for handling wind noise from an actor, it's actually always has been a massive challenge. There's really kind of only two ways to answer the question. One way is to try a different mic placement on the head, because with certain face shapes, the wind noise is escalated by the shape of their face. As they move around, the air hits their face in a specific way, and it gets up into the microphone grill, and you get more noise that way. That being said, oftentimes the best way that we actually handle it is through extremely active mixing. So when that actor is not talking, their mic is not on.
There you go.
Yeah, that's what you do.
Okay, unfortunately, we are out of time, and we still have some really great questions. So if we didn't get to your question, please feel free to shoot it over to us at support@shure.com, and we will get back to you with an answer. But we want to thank you so much for joining this webinar, and we will see you next month.